In this module, I'd like to talk about the interworking between Webex calling and dedicated instance, and also cloud-connected PSTN for Webex calling dedicated instance. Let's start with the interworking between Webex calling dedicated instance and Webex calling. In the earlier modules, Fred already discussed the interworking between Webex calling and on-premises communications manager. And technically, everything he presented in that module also applies to the interworking between Webex calling multi-tenant and Webex calling dedicated instance. Because Webex calling dedicated instance is actually communications manager. It's running in the cloud, but it's the same functionality, same code base, same system. So basically, the connection between Webex calling and Webex calling dedicated instance is identical to the integration with Communications Manager. There's a zip trunk between Webex calling and the Communications Manager. There's a local gateway in between there, and you have to configure call routing on both sides to basically send calls between Webex calling and dedicated instance. On the Communications Manager side, this is done using the Communications Manager dial plan magic by basically adding route patterns to your enterprise dial plan on Communications Manager. And on Webex calling, we can either set up dial plans on Webex calling to steer calls over, or we can make use of the concept of route lists, which I will specifically cover in this section about cloud-connected PSTN for Webex calling dedicated instance. There are a few differences if we come between the integration to dedicated instance and the trunking to Communications Manager. Specifically, the local gateway and the trunks, both on Communications Manager and on Webex calling, are pre-provisioned when we talk about Webex calling dedicated instance. So those are set up and configured by Cisco, and you'll see them showing up in Control Hub and in your Communications Manager administration without your intervention. And also the Cloud PSTN for dedicated instance users based on route list. That's the difference, and this will be covered in a dedicated section. So what is pre-configured or pre-provisioned? We see trunks and route groups on Webex calling multi-tenant. They are automatically created. The location for a trunk, so this trunk that is pre-provisioned lives in a dedicated location. You would still need to set the main number though for that location. Cisco is not adding a main number for that location. And without that main number configured, you won't be able to send or receive calls on that trunk. So that's something you still need to do. The actual local gateway instance on that is used for this interconnection is also automatically provisioned, and it's cloud managed, and it's running in the Cisco data center as well. And the zip trunk on Communications Manager on the Webex calling dedicated instance is also pre-provisioned. What you still need to do though is, on top of that, create the deterministic call routing between these two call controls. So both on dedicated instance by massaging the enterprise dial plan and adding the appropriate dial patterns, route patterns, and on Webex calling by configuring a dial plan and or route lists. So when we look at a typical customer that's migrating from on-premises Communications Manager to Webex calling, we typically require interworking during the transition period between the on-premises Communications Manager and the cloud. If the customer is migrating or transitioning to a scenario, to a target scenario where both call controls will exist, so Webex calling multi-tenant and Webex calling dedicated instance, the question comes up, so what is the best way to interconnect these systems? Do we only throw in a trunk between Communications Manager on premises and Webex calling dedicated instance. With this single trunk between Communications Manager on premises and Webex calling dedicated instance, what you basically build is a topology where all calls from on-premises users, basically users down here, to Webex calling users, would traverse through Webex calling dedicated instance. And that's technically not what Webex calling dedicated instance is meant to be. Webex calling dedicated instance is not meant to act as a tandem switch. So you could throw in another trunk between on-premises Communications Manager and Webex calling using a local gateway. But then the question is, do you build the full triangle or you just do this trunk? So what's the best practice here? What's the recommendation? The challenge here is that's one of those typical cases where the standard Cisco answer would apply. It depends. So it depends on a number of factors. Things to consider include, one, as I mentioned earlier, dedicated instance is not meant to act as a tandem. Also, you probably want to look at where the majority of your users will live. If the majority of the users will end up being on Webex calling dedicated instance, then definitely this trunk is required. But then still, if part of your population end up on Webex calling multi-tenant, or the majority ends up there, you also want to have this trunk in place. If you have both, then the dial plan configuration on Communications Manager on premises down here would need to reflect that, right? You would need to make sure that you have basically two routes and maintain two sets of routes to Webex calling multi-tenant and to dedicated instance. Also, you need to make sure that you understand that the trunk between multi-tenant and between Webex calling multi-tenant and on-premises UCM, it's a pure calling integration. So you will not get any simple presence across that trunk, and also features like call completion no response or call completion busy subscriber. Nothing like that works. Whereas on this trunk, you could technically build out these features, CCNR and CCBS, by enabling QSIG on that SIP trunk. On the other hand, if this is only for a transition scenario, then I don't think that features like CCNR and CCBS are actually that important. Right? Another scenario is if you basically use or abuse Webex calling dedicated instance as a transit for your on-premises users, then technically what you could do is you could use Cloud PSTN, basically a cloud-connected PSTN provider for users that for Webex calling multi-tenant seem to live on DI, but which are technically actually on premises, right? So basically what I'm saying is a user down here on Communications Manager on premise could place a PSTN call. That call would be routed to DI using based on the enterprise dial plan configuration here on UCM. And then DI would basically forward that call on to Webex calling multi-tenant, and that would potentially allow this user down here to consume Cloud PSTN. That's technically possible. That's nothing we want to support, but all of these factors basically go into this design decision what to do. I mean, technically, I would think if it's only for a transition scenario, I would try to keep this topology simple, to basically just have one of those trunks in there. And then, for example, if you only throw in the trunk between on-premises, UCM, and multi-tenant, then Webex calling multi-tenant can definitely act as a tandem switch and route calls between the two communications managers involved. All right, for this transit routing from Communications Manager on premises to dedicated instance via multi-tenant, you would need to configure basically the reachability here, right? You would need to configure route patterns in some shape or form on premises that point to Webex calling multi-tenant for all the destinations here on Communications Manager. To simplify this type of deployment, what you could do is you could enable ILS or GDPR, global dial plan replication, between these guys and let them exchange reachability information based on GDPR. And this works although there's no direct SIP trunk between these communications manager instances. Keep in mind that the ILS topologies, or the topology of connections that's used to exchange reachability information, is independent of the SIP trunking topology. So you could have an ILS GDPR exchange directly between these guys and then still route the calls via Webex calling multi-tenant. The way to achieve this is to basically have the SIP route patterns that route on the SIP route strings of these catalogs exchanged, to have these SIP route patterns point up to multi-tenant from both sides, and then this would actually work. For that, you would actually need 3 SIP route strings, basically one route string for the catalog advertised by Webex calling dedicated instance, one route string for the catalog advertised by communications manager on premises, and there could be technically a 3rd SIP route string involved for everything that lives on Webex calling multi-tenant. The imported catalog, you would use an imported catalog for the destinations on Webex calling multi-tenant. You could import that catalog on either communications manager based on how GDPR works. If you import a catalog over here, that will also be advertised to the other guy. I think in topologies like this, using GDPR and specifically using an imported catalog for the multi-tenant destination simplifies the configuration of these guys here, of these communications manager involved, because without an imported catalog, you would basically have to do the same configuration for all the patterns living on multi-tenant, both on Webex calling dedicated instance and on your on-premises communications manager. So how does this import catalog thing work? If you look at this example, here we have a CSV file that has destinations in it, and the first 2 rows basically represent +E164 destinations in Webex calling. These could be fully qualified +E164 numbers, or like in this case, you could use patterns covering complete ranges. And then the 3rd row here is an enterprise significant number reflecting an abbreviated intersite dialing to Webex calling. We need to make sure that we break GDPR PSTN failover. Why? So the way GDPR works is as follows. If a GDPR learned destination is dialed, then communications manager tries to route the call following the GDPR route. And if that for some reason fails, communications manager falls back to a PSTN route and tries to redial that same destination via the PSTN. Given that specifically in the case of premises PSTN, UCM actually might be the PSTN for Webex calling, it doesn't make too much sense to retry that call via the PSTN if it doesn't work directly. So to make sure that this fails, that GDPR PSTN failover doesn't work, what we do is we basically use the PSTN failover strip prefix instructions here to create illegal numbers that start with +0. And then in Communications Manager, it's very easy to just have a translation pattern in your dial plan that matches on +0 and then fails those calls. So we can selectively fail all the GDPR PSTN failover calls. So what does the import catalog thing give us? It allows to share basically Webex calling destinations between clusters. That also applies to more complex deployment topologies where your on-premises deployment has a session manager and multiple leaf clusters. So as I mentioned earlier briefly, if you import the catalog on one of the communications managers, that information is basically distributed down to all other UCMs involved in your GDPR exchange. Another design consideration here is that if you have calls coming in from Webex calling into Communications Manager or TI, then, and you have this complex topology, then these calls need to have access to the destinations learned from other clusters as well. In Communications Manager, everything that you learn from any catalogs, whether it's an imported catalog or just a remote cluster, ends up in the same partition. So you cannot create differentiated class of service based on where you learned that stuff from. Everything is in the same partition. To break the loop, so to avoid that calls coming from Webex calling can be routed back to Webex calling because they match by misconfiguration a pattern that's part of an imported catalog, what you could do is you can make sure that the zip route pattern that's in your dial plan to match on the route string of the GDPR catalog, that this zip route pattern is in a different partition, and that the trunk coming from Webex calling in the incoming CSS doesn't have access to this specific partition. And that makes sure that calls coming from Webex calling, even if they hit a GDPR learn pattern, are not getting sent back to Webex calling. All right, with that, let's take a look at cloud-connected PSTN for dedicated instance. If we go back to the earlier modules, in this connectivity matrix, I discussed that on regular trunks, regular premises trunks, calls that are tagged as premises come from a trunk don't have access to cloud PSTN. And that's something that we needed to change for users on Communications Manager on Webex calling dedicated instance. So we had to make sure, we had to come up with a proper way to configure PSTN access for users on dedicated instance to cloud connected PSTN. So for that, we introduced basically the concept of a route list. And the purpose of a route list is to define or identify a set of users based on their TNs, based on +E164 TNs, and then allow PSTN access for calls originating from a trunk to a cloud-connected PSTN provider. And this applies to both directions, right? From the cloud-connected PSTN provider to dedicated instance via a route group or trunk, and from dedicated instance to the cloud-connected PSTN provider based on a caller ID match of the call coming into Webex calling. The way this works is in Webex calling, you get your phone numbers, you get your TNs added to your location the usual way from your cloud-connected PSTN provider. And then you create a route list. And in that route list, you can add, or to that route list, you can add up to 40,000 unassigned numbers from your hosted TN pool. So it's a two-step process, right? First, the phone numbers have to exist in Control Hub. They have to be assigned to your location. And then secondly, you can assign these TNs to a route list. And then the route list gets a destination, basically a route group pointing to some trunks, pointing to dedicated instance. Adding these TNs, adding these PSTN numbers to route lists can be done in 3 different ways. One, you can in Control Hub manually add phone numbers in batches. Secondly, you can use CSV file import to assign numbers to a route list, or you can use the Webex calling provisioning APIs. Looking at the full setup here in this graphic, what I'm trying to show here is the following. We have a location, we have a route list configured in location with a bunch of phone numbers in it. For this location, San Jose, we have a PSTN connection configured, and any user in this location would use that PSTN connection to reach the PSTN. We have a cloud-connected PSTN provider provisioned here. Then we have our DI route group this is basically the destination configured for this route list. So every call hitting the route list will be sent to dedicated instance via this route group and to trunks. And then we have our additional location that I mentioned earlier, the dedicated location that's created for these auto-created trunks between Webex calling multi-tenant and dedicated instance. All right, so now you can have multiple locations in Webex calling, and these locations could use the same DI route group, so the same connectivity to dedicated instance, and that location could use the same cloud-connected PSTN provider, and it could be a different PSTN provider. Right? If you look at any of these locations here now, let's start with the one on top, you see that there's two trunks or connections here. One is the connection to the route group. That's basically how Webex calling and PSTN users reach the dedicated instance users. Those calls would be sent down this trunk through this route group and then over to dedicated instance. And then we have this guy here. This is basically how users at a location reach the PSTN, and that applies both for Webex calling multi-tenant users in this location and also for users on dedicated instance where the call gets sent to Webex calling. It basically hits Webex calling from this trunk. Then we see a route list match. The route list match associates the user with this location, and then the PSTN connection configured on that location is used to send calls to the PSTN. As a reminder, this was the matrix, the connectivity matrix that I showed in one of the earlier modules here. And there we can see that there's a difference between trunks where we have a trunks used for dedicated instance and trunks used for premises PSTN. And specifically here for trunks, when we have a route list match on the caller ID incoming, then we can send the call to cloud connected PSTN. And in the other direction, for calls originating from cloud PSTN with a route list match, this is allowed. Whereas with regular trunks, the equivalent flows wouldn't be allowed, the call would be blocked. So let's look at a quick example finally how this actually works. The call flow here that I want to show is from the PSTN to the dedicated instance user. So we have an incoming call to this phone number down here. On Webex calling, we see that there's a route list match. So this phone number was added to a route list. The route list has a configured destination. The call is sent to Communications Manager, to Webex calling dedicated instance. And here the dial plan magic kicks in and the call is sent to the phone that is registered with Webex calling dedicated instance. The call flow in the other direction works like this. A user on Webex calling dedicated instance places a call. The call is then handled by Communications Manager, by Webex calling dedicated instance. The enterprise dial plan configured here on Webex calling dedicated instance makes sure that the call is sent to Webex calling multi-tenant via the local gateway. And then on Webex calling multi-tenant, we find a caller ID match. So the caller ID of the call sent to Webex calling matches a TN configured in one of the route lists. And thus the call is classified as a Webex calling user call and is sent to the PSTN using the PSTN choice configured on this location. This is basically how the call flow works in both directions. What you see here clearly in that picture is that this call classification is based on the caller ID match. And thus you want to make sure that you properly set up your Webex calling dedicated instance configuration so that +E164 caller ID is presented to Webex calling, else this caller ID match will not work. All right, with that, I'm done with this module. Thank you very much. This concludes this module.